and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Leo Baeck Institute to this panel discussion, Holocaust History in the 21st Century. My name is David Brown. I'm Director of Programs and Communications at Leo Baeck Institute. For those of you who are not familiar, Leo Baeck Institute is a library and archive based in the Center for Jewish History in New York, and we are dedicated to preserving the history and culture of German-speaking Jews. We have large archival library and art collections. We support scholarship in this area. We put on exhibitions, and I hope that if you're ever in New York, you'll come see us here in the Center for Jewish History in Manhattan to visit some of our exhibitions. And we do programs like this. And this program in particular, we're doing as part of a year-long project that we're engaged in called the Shared History Project, 1700 Years of Jewish Life in German-Speaking Lands. That is Leo Baeck Institute's contribution to a much larger project funded by the German government in collaboration with a number of museums, libraries, Jewish community institutions, to mark, really to celebrate and explore Jewish life in Germany today. And for Leo Baeck Institute in particular, an important focus of the project is to look back at the long history of Jewish life in German-speaking lands. And we have an online exhibition at the website sharedhistoryproject.org that's been shared in the chat that has been featuring an object every week for the last year, with 2 essays by scholars, experts on the topic, journalists, scholars, and other authors. I invite you to check that out. And as we've gone along, we've sort of divided that history somewhat artificially into epochs. And we've held a panel discussion with experts for each of those epochs. And we have reached, at this point, a very important and disturbing chapter in that history, of course, the Holocaust. And I don't want to say too much about the project because I think it speaks for itself. I hope you'll go visit it after this discussion if you haven't already. But we had to make some decisions in developing this project about how much weight to give this momentous event, but which happened in a very compressed time frame compared to this nearly 2 millennia history. So we decided that we were devoting a week to each object, but we decided that the Holocaust demanded closer attention. So we actually chose 7 objects for the Holocaust. They range from a prayer room in the Theresienstadt ghetto to a doll brought by a kinder transport kind to the United Kingdom, Jewish stars printed in a factory that was expropriated from a Jewish family, and a pendant found in the Sobibor death camp. So we're not going to get into these objects in the discussion, but I do hope that you'll go back and take a look at the objects and the essays with the context of this discussion in mind. So nearly a lifetime after the end of the Holocaust, with eyewitnesses passing away and challenges from Holocaust deniers and governments seeking to whitewash their history, it's very important, I think, right now to have the discussion that we're about to have and look into the future of Holocaust studies. And we're very lucky to have a panel of experts who are all engaged in scholarship and have an academic and wissenschaftliche Perspektive on the Holocaust, but who are also engaged in various ways in the NGO sector, in education, in translating that scholarly work into public understanding. And it's my pleasure to introduce them. I'll just start reading in alphabetical order. We have Elizabeth Anthony, Director of Visiting Scholar Programs at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Her research focuses on the post-war Jewish community of Vienna and the records of the International Tracing Service. And she's the author of The Compromise of Return, Viennese Jews After the Holocaust, which came out this year. From 2005 to 2007, she was also a caseworker and casework manager for Hayes in Vienna, Austria. Anna Hájková is Associate Professor of Modern European Continental History at the University of Warwick in the UK. She is the author of The Last Ghetto, An Everyday History of Theresienstadt, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2020, and is really a monumental and masterpiece study of prison society during the Holocaust based on archival sources from dozens of archives from 10 countries and in 9 languages. We also have with us Joanna Sliwa, a historian at the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, or the Claims Conference. Her research focuses on the Holocaust in Poland and on Polish Jewish history. Joanna has taught at Keene University and Rutgers University and served as an educator in teacher training programs on the Holocaust. Joanna's book, Jewish Childhood in Krakow, A Microhistory of the Holocaust, Rutgers University Press, 2021, won the 2020 Ernst Fraenkel Prize from the Wiener Holocaust Library in London. And moderating our discussion today, Aubrey Pomerance is head of the archives of the Jewish Museum Berlin and of the branch of the archives of the Leo Baeck Institute at the museum. He also co-curated the segment Catastrophe in the museum's new core exhibition, which portrays the lives and fates of Jews in Germany during the period of National Socialism. And he has published on Jewish memorial culture, German Jewish fates in the Nazi period, and on archival pedagogy. And he is also a contributor to the Shared History Project. So thank you to our panelists. And Aubrey, I'll turn it over to you for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Good evening to everyone from Berlin. Thank you very much for the kind introductions, David. I speak in the name of all our panelists as well. Thank you also for the invitation to myself to moderate this afternoon's discussion. I'm very much looking forward to it. As David said, 3 major works have appeared within the last 12 months by our panelists. And these recent publications explore various themes on the Holocaust. They make cutting-edge interventions. They've inspired new avenues of research, and they draw upon numerous historical methods and a robust scholarship on the topic of the Holocaust. I'd like to ask our panelists to begin by reflecting on how your recent works have engaged with the past, present, and future of Holocaust historiography. And we'll begin with Betsy Anthony.
Thank you, Aubrey, and thanks to the Leo Baeck Institute for the invitation to have us here today. It's an honor and a pleasure. So my book is about the return of Viennese Jews to Vienna to live after the Holocaust, what motivated them, what they expected, and then of course what they encountered with neighbors, in regaining careers, rejoining society there, and also rebuilding the Jewish community and Jewish communal institutions. And while there's considerable scholarship addressing the Holocaust and survival, Jews' experiences, and in the past 20 years or so, also increasing work on displaced persons and the DP era, there's been relatively little on the return of European Jews to their hometowns to reestablish lives there. An edited volume by David Bankier is very important, but actually didn't include anything on Austria. Dinke Hundius's study of Dutch Jews who returned to the Netherlands, Michael Brenner and the German Jews, all important works, but so very few. More recently, Lukasz Jajanowski's Ghost Citizens, about the return of Jews to Radom in Poland, has come out. Lukasz and I were in graduate school at the same time and ended up on many panels together as a result of being some of the only ones addressing the topic. And so in particular return, and specific geographic case studies like this are few. But I think that the time lapsed since the end of the war and the many decades of rebuilding and resuming or regaining permanent places in cities, towns, and countries meant that it required time to better address and reflect upon the immediate post-war years and subsequent developments and evolutions. On top of the scant attention focused on return as a topic, there's also relatively little on Austria and Vienna and the Holocaust, how it relates to and involves Austria and Vienna, and even less on the post-war. A couple of important books for my work: Helga Empacker's book on Jews in general in Austria after the war, and Evelyn Bedonka's institutional history of the Viennese Jewish community. As I said, we're both very important, but both are in German and therefore maybe not as accessible, but also one was published in 1995 and the other in 2000. So there was a lot of room and I think need for my study in the context of Austrian and Viennese history relating to the Holocaust and in Holocaust studies overall.
Okay, thank you, Betsy. We're going to come back to a very important question about the post-war period and its place in Holocaust historiography. Anna, your relationship to past, present, future Holocaust historiography.
I do want to echo Betsy first and say it's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today, even though the UK Wi-Fi is reliably spotty, which is why I had to move. And I want to share with you a little bit about my intellectual journey and place myself on the chronology. My background is in Jewish Holocaust history. This is how I wrote the dissertation on which my Therese Instead book is based. And I looked at the prisoner society, at space for maneuver, how the social emerges, whether we can actually talk about social in the most extreme of circumstances. I explored the microhistory of choices, of decisions. I looked at the old but still very important question of agency and choices that at the same time as I was thinking about them, Eliana Adler wrote her really a super important article that came out in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and independently from each other, we came to the same conclusions. That work on everyday history of the Holocaust I continue today in my second project that explores sexuality and microhistory of a small concentration camp, a satellite camp of Neuengamme in Neugraben, where I look at 500 women, a story of an enforced queer relationship between a guard and the Jewish woman prisoner. But I also look at the larger sexual barter. I look at the everyday life. I look at the support, but also exploitation of these women. And I look how gender works in these enforced conditions. I believe that microhistory and Holocaust are currently one of the most exciting topics. I want to mention here people like Waitman Beorn with his work on Janowska, Benjamin Leb, who I see here with his work on Rasiko, or Janine Holtz on the Trautenau camps. I also have been thinking extensively about testimonies and the narrativity of why do people bear testimony, how do they speak about the unspeakable, how do certain things become silenced, and how do we find framing for the genocide. And here I see myself in the tradition of scholars such as Laura Jokusz, Alexandra Garbarini, Lisa Lev, or Natalia Alekshun. And rather than paying attention to the actual details, but the metaphors, the narratives of the speech, this is something that I find very exciting. Here we are kind of in the classical tradition of cultural history of the Holocaust. I have also seen Dan Stone, who has written really the inspiring article about how can we conceptualize intellectual and cultural history of the Holocaust. And maybe the last point, we are also today in the US, and what I find immensely important in the last 3 or 4 years, that we realize we do not just sit in our ivory tower, but we very much also have a responsibility as public intellectuals. I very much admire my colleague Benjamin Head, who takes the time that none of us have and sometimes publishes articles from the viewpoint of a historian about the very worrisome developments that have been happening in the US or here in the UK or in Germany, whether it's people who refuse to be vaccinated and depict themselves as Holocaust victims, or about response to the 6th of January and anything else. I think many of us have these responsibilities. And the question is, what is a meaningful, engaged history of the Holocaust? What is our task? For me, the last bit of my work is relevant here because I've been working on the history of the Jewish left, of the Jewish communists of the generation of 1910. I've been thinking about what it means to be an underground communist in Theresienstadt or Warsaw Ghetto. And rather than kind of come with simplistic AOC comparisons, this is a complicated history. There is not necessarily a conclusion, but it's immensely rewarding and worthwhile to think about it. And often I think it's not necessarily about the outcome, but about the thinking together. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna. You raised some very important issues, in particular the changing nature of the responsibility of the writing of the Holocaust. And you also mentioned testimonies, and testimonies play such an important, they serve as such an important source for all three of your works. And that's also something I think we'll also readdress in the course of our conversation. Joanna, your book also is surprisingly dealing with a very significant Jewish city, Krakow, of which was really under-illuminated in so many aspects. How have you been influenced by what's been written before and what has not been written about the experience of Jews in Krakow and the Krakow ghetto?
Thank you, Aubrey. And I would like to also join my co-panelists, Betsy and Anna, to thank the Leo Baeck Institute for this panel and for inviting us. And it's a pleasure to be with my colleagues and to talk about these various issues that matter to us and that we are occupied with in our daily lives. So my book tells how the Holocaust unfolded in Krakow, Poland, through the recollections and experiences of Jewish children. And by employing a microhistory lens, and Anna already mentioned this, kind of trend, the book tells a larger story about Jewish daily life during the Holocaust, about relations between Jews and non-Jews, about Jewish agency. And obviously, Aubrey, you pointed it out, the book engages with the history of Krakow, which was the capital of German-occupied Poland during World War II. My book draws upon, and I hope contributes to, a robust trend in Holocaust studies that centers on the notions of geography, space, topography. And one of the classic works on this subject is the collection Geographies of the Holocaust, published in 2014, edited by Ann Knowles, Tim Cole, and Alberto Giordano. I was interested in examining how children's experiences in sites of persecution, in physical structures, in gender and age-specific places. And I was also interested in how mobility defined children's lives during the Holocaust. Now, the focus on Jewish children is not new. Historian Deborah Dwork has really blazed the trail with her book, Children with a Star, that was published in 1991. Dwork's research illuminated the patterns of persecution and survival of Jewish children across Nazi-occupied Europe. The book was really the first to use the voices of children and of child survivors as legitimate historical sources. And here again, I mentioned testimonies, right? Anne already mentioned, and Aubrey, you pointed out to it as well. And it was really this book, Children with a Star, that inspired my own research. And I was very fortunate to have Professor Dwork as my doctoral advisor. But in my own work, I was interested in exploring how age determined children's perceptions and behaviors, and how individuals and groups responded to the dire situation of children. I was also curious about how children's physical size affected what young people witnessed. And of course, speaking about the future, there are some threads in my book that engage with what I see as the future of Holocaust research. And some of these include topics of Jews as rescuers, relations among Jews, histories of smaller Jewish communities, and then a focus on marginalized histories and historical actors.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joanna. I think also that you've provided a really important extension of some of the work that Dalia Ofer has done about Jewish families in Poland and Javi Dreyfus. And I absolutely agree that there's so much pertaining also to solidarity and to also it's very interesting you mentioned age, because age is such a different issue when we're dealing with the Holocaust in that period of time. What does age mean as a child? We can't compare it with what you also refer to very often in your work as the normal life outside of the ghetto. So that's also something which is definitely a desiderata, which we will also be speaking briefly about as I see time progressing. The Holocaust studies, they continue to yield new research, fresh perspectives that all three of you have provided, and a constantly growing body of multilingual literature. I think this is also one of the reasons why there is so much work still to be done, because new sources are appearing, and we have to really be very honest that there just are not a huge number of scholars who have the linguistic abilities to be able to conquer all of the multilingual sources. The history of the Holocaust, as it's followed and contributed to a range of turns from cultural, narrative, forensic, spatial to gender, and many more. And in all of your current scholarly work, you've each employed another lens to examine Holocaust history. And it relates to aging. We just spoke about children, but you're all very much concerned and working on the aspect of aging and the experience of the elderly during and after the Holocaust. And I wonder if the three of you, see this as being the or one of the next big themes in Holocaust historiography, one of the really true great desiderata in the field. And it'd be also very interesting for all of us who are tuned in today to learn what's inspired your interest in this topic. And we will keep the order. Betsy?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I certainly do see this as an important and emerging theme. That is the elderly. In the course of my own research, I found this interesting little nursing home. It is actually a nursing home still today, run by the city of Vienna, as it has been since the 1980s. But the history of the home is long and very important to the Jewish community. I discovered the nursing home at Seegasse 9 on a walking tour of my neighborhood in Vienna. And when I saw the centuries-old Jewish cemetery in the courtyard, I started asking questions. I'm not the only one. If you've taken a Jewish tour of Vienna, you may have visited the cemetery at the Seegasse 9 nursing home. But it was all new to me at that point, and I found that this curiosity about my little neighborhood actually fit perfectly into my work. There had been a Jewish hospital or nursing home located at Seegasse 9 since 1698. It was owned and run by the Jewish community from 1698 until 1943, when the Waffen-SS took it over to use as a barracks in the city. But then in 1945, it was returned to the Jewish community, which used it again as a nursing home, specifically for returning camp survivors. Seegasse 9 is in what was the US zone of Vienna. And so there's both Viennese Jewish community documentation of the home, as well as some US Army material. The US Army called it a DP camp, but it was full of, or maybe like 80% full of, elderly Viennese Jews. And first of all, I mean, if they're Viennese, my big question is, if they're Viennese, are they technically DPs? No, they weren't. They shouldn't have been. They were homeless and displaced, but not officially displaced persons, because they didn't find themselves displaced outside of their home country. So this was my first, big question in this area, the US Army had called it a DP camp, apparently to enable the kind of support they could offer to DPs, but they were Viennese. But also, I realized when I read the census lists from the home, there were camp survivors in that home over the age of 60 and over 70, and even a few over the age of 80. They had been in concentration camps, and as Viennese Jews, that largely meant terezins, so relating a lot to what Anna may have to say. And it was this, finding a pocket of elderly camp survivors that sparked my interest and realization there was a group of survivors that largely have been ignored. Of course, there are also other elderly survivors who had been protected in mixed marriages or by some mixed family heritage. But in any case, a distinct group of Viennese Jewish survivors over the age of 60. And so it was really kind of finding this nursing home and finding this documentation about it that led me to, I don't want to say discover necessarily, but to come to realize about this idea of elderly survivors in Vienna.
Yeah, and I understand that that's the next project that you are going to be working on, and I know that you hope that there'll be a book coming out of this.
Yes, that's the plan.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Anna, in your book, the elderly are really at the bottom rung of the hierarchy of Theresienstadt. They have the least chance of surviving, and yet, as we heard from Betsy, many did survive. I think probably the largest number of elderly survived in Ghetto Theresienstadt. Could you please also tell us a little bit about if your interest only stems from your work on Theresienstadt, or are there other sources that have led you to this topic?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, indeed, many of the sources I read were taken exactly in that Altersheim, and there is something profoundly tragic when you look at testimonies of people who have come out of Theresienstadt. They have lost everyone, they have lost everything. You can find out from the Matriken Register, from the registries, that soon they will pass away. And the last thing they do is to sit down and write a testimony about what they experienced in Theresienstadt. I came to the elderly because my aim in writing the dissertation was to look at all the sources. I wanted to get off the beaten track. I wanted to move beyond the established mass narrative of Theresienstadt that tells the story about community full of solidarity, where there is no violent crime, where everybody's helping the weakest, defined as children, where there is meaningful art production, and where there is lots of solidarity. And this is not a wrong account, but it is a useful past, and it's not the whole account. And this is why I tried to look at as many testimonies and self-testimonies and diaries and letters and documentation of the self-administration, and indeed even the trials with the SS as possible. This is why I also spent 3 very beautiful months at the LBI working with the wonderful archivist Michael Simonson, who's today with us as well. And I was struck fairly early on how many of the people who bore testimony, whether they passed away or survived to tell the story after the war, because there are many diaries where elderly, either from the Protectorate, from Germany, or from Austria. And therefore, fairly early on in the PhD, I wrote a paper where I tried to conceptualize the experience, the subjectivities of the German Jewish elderly. Now, this is not an exception because the Nazis, when they set up Theresienstadt as an advantage camp, they specifically deported people above 65 years of age from the Altreich and from Austria. So we have a significant group here. And indeed, the conditions for people above 65 years of age were vastly, vastly worse. They had the worst accommodation, the worst food, and therefore the mortality is much higher. But that does not mean that they only talk about suffering. They were incredibly observant chroniclers of Theresienstadt. And while they may have been the underdogs, they had the first word. However, even though they have been such eloquent narrators of Theresienstadt, their testimonies have been largely disregarded. I mean, Hage Adler, in his classic of Theresienstadt, paid ample attention to them, But while Hage Adler is often cited, very few people have actually read him because it's a very long and very wordy book. And especially the younger accounts of Theresienstadt do not really pay attention to the elderly at all. So I have tried to do a bit of a social justice and include them into the stories and reflect and contrast these testimonies and always ask what it means. I do not plan to write another article about the elderly. I think I have done it quite extensively in my publications, in a piece forthcoming in Yad Vashem Studies and in the book, but I was really delighted at the same time as I was defending that there was a burgeoning of new scholarship. There was Liz Strauss's beautiful dissertation about the elderly in Łódź and elsewhere that will come out as a book. Then Dan Stone wrote his famous article for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. There is Betsy's book. And now there will be not one, but two special issues of Yad Vashem Studies. And the little bird told me maybe also an anthology with Routledge. So I kind of am happy to see where this is going. And I think we all need to think very hard in the canon of Holocaust testimonies, who was given a voice, to whom we paid attention, and who was not allowed to bear testimony, or who bore testimony it was disregarded, because that part is also part of narrativity.
Thank you very much, Anna. Joanna, have you looked also closer at the elderly society within the Krakow ghetto, or is that something that you're setting your sights on now?
That is a great question. No, during my research on Krakow, I have not, I did not come across any information about the elderly, and I am interested in marginalized groups. And so that was very strange to me that I couldn't find any information, but I think I wasn't looking at that time for that information because I was looking for information about children. And so I will talk a little bit about how I came to be interested in the elderly. For me, the common narrative about elderly Jews in the Holocaust centers on their vulnerability and death. And Anna just did a great overview of the various research that's been done to date to counter that narrative. And for me, what has always been missing was this question of how older Jews experienced the Holocaust. To what extent did their social networks help or hinder the survival strategies of elderly Jews? How did other Jews respond to the plight of the elderly? And Anna's work engages with this beautifully in the case of Theresienstadt. A relatively small number of older Jews survived the Holocaust. And what happened to them? These are some questions that led Dr. Christine Schmidt, who is the deputy director and head of research at the Wiener Holocaust Library, and who I believe is with us today, and Betsy and me to work on a volume that would incorporate the experiences of elderly Jews into Holocaust historiography, and that would highlight histories by and about older Jews. And my inspiration to engage in this topic came through my work in Jewish nonprofits. At the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, I had the opportunity to access really fascinating historical material about the organization's activities. The JDC archives contain extensive information, which is digitized, available online. Check it out after this program, about efforts on behalf of elderly and aging survivors. The JDC was able to pursue many of its programs with allocations from the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, in short, the Claims Conference. So since then, since my work at JDC, I have moved on to work at the Claims Conference, which negotiates with the German government for compensation and care for Jewish Holocaust survivors. And over the years, the Claims Conference has established a blueprint for advocating for and assisting older survivors. As a historian, I wanted to learn more about the landscape of care for elderly survivors, especially in the first several years after World War II. So my research centers on the early initiatives of the Claims Conference and of its member organization, the JDC. I was interested in how international and local Jewish organizations evaluated the situation of elderly and aging survivors. I wanted to learn more about how these organizations envisioned elderly care and what kind of age-tailored and need-based projects they supported. This exploration into the situation of the elderly and aging survivors, I think also yields a very compelling narrative about the institutional histories of these two major international Jewish organizations. And I think that a focus on the elderly and aging survivors offers very important avenues of knowledge about the past, but also how the past affects the present and informs the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. If you'll allow me just to add a thought of my own, I think that there's very much a dearth of research done on the elderly also who did not survive. I'm thinking of the treasures that are both in the archives of the Jewish Museum Berlin and the Leo Baeck Institute with regard to correspondence that the elderly are writing to their families, to their children and their grandchildren who were able to emigrate, to flee Germany, to get out of Germany. But the elderly, of course, were the ones that were least able then to get out, especially in the years after Kristallnacht and especially after the beginning of the war, although there were still people getting out. And they really do reveal also everyday life of the elderly in the cities where they were until they were deported. So I think that's really an untapped source that I really hope will become the focus of research in the coming years. That's dealing with Germany. I don't know if there's the same type of source material in other countries, Austria for sure, but whether or not in the further east is yet to be seen. So moving on, we also in preparation spoke about the availability of archival collections and newly accessible sources, which we've touched on briefly yet now. Digital technology, of course, interdisciplinary methods are some of the endeavors that have enabled Holocaust historians to employ new techniques to analyze the past. An understanding of the origins and the inspiration of different forms of Holocaust documentation is ever evolving, along with modes of utilization of these sources. How have these directions affected your own research, and where do you see the desiderata connected to the emergence, availability, and new reading of the documentation on the Holocaust? Betsy, the floor is yours once again.
Thank you. Yes, as as the question states, of course, availability and digitization has been such an important thing in my own work. Because of the history of the Viennese Jewish community, the communal archives relating to Vienna are held in different places around the world. Luckily for me, in places that I call home and so are happily accessible, both to me in Washington at my own museum and also in Vienna. Digitization of these archives hasn't yet come to be completely. So the fact that my own life makes the Jewish community collections accessible to me has been an important coincidence. But the digitization of the kinds of ego documents by this, diaries and letters and unpublished memoirs and oral testimonies and interviews that are available on the internet too have made it so that I and we all have plenty of voices on which to rely and to which to refer in creating a clear picture of the experiences of the people about whom we write. I should note that this includes important collections for my work, important collections at the Leo Baeck Institute, including its Austrian Heritage Collection. In the short time since finishing my manuscript, so much more has become available and accessible from the comfort of one's living room. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the increasing public availability of the International Tracing Service Archive via the Erelson Archives online digital archive, and the excellent digital availability in a number of locations around the world. It's a unique source of post-war, well, wartime and post-war documentation that includes different forms of testimony, as well as wartime prisoner documentation that really complements oral histories and diaries and letters and memoirs to further pinpoint experiences and dates and locations of victims during the Holocaust. The ever increasing availability, thanks to digital technologies, means there's still so much hope for someone like me to find more letters and more unpublished memoir pieces, something that, you know, not too long ago would have meant worldwide travel and long stays at places I can now log into from home. Bringing together a letter held at the Wiener Library in London with a memoir at Leo Baeck in New York, for example, just might not have happened a few years ago. So it's been very significant for me, and I would venture to say all of us in our work.
Yeah, no question about that. When I started at the Jewish Museum Berlin over 20 years ago, we established the branch of the Leo Baeck Institute archives there and built it up to 5,000 microfilms. And we had scholars coming from all of Europe and from Israel to come and do research. And that's turned into a trickle now because the Leo Baeck Institute has 90% of its holdings now online. So it's absolutely exemplary what the Leo Baeck Institute has done. And it's absolutely wonderful to see so many other institutions following suit. I'm thinking of, I'm working also very regularly with the AJC archives, where there's a lot of material available online, and also ITS, which is very important. And especially the ITS archives really opening up new ways to look and address the Holocaust. I remember the workshops that took place there around 10 years ago, bringing scholars, Holocaust scholars from around the world to examine up until then completely unknown source material. Anna, your reflections on this question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I will take it a little bit differently in the methodological way. I find it immensely important to build on what Betsy you said about cross-checking between London and New York and the availability of records, not to take just one source, but to dig deeper. To that belongs also knowing where to dig deeper. And you get there with experience or with talking with colleagues. And for that, I have really seen in the last 5 years, social media, in particular, history and Twitter, has been immensely collegial and helpful. Whether it's about putting together a syllabus or asking about more research on a topic, I think collegial solidarity that really took off during the pandemic is something that we need to close to appreciate. But to give you an example on of a topic that I've been working on, we have here a very troubling, difficult, and fascinating story of sexual coercion of 2 Jewish women in hiding in Berlin. And they hide with a man who is apparently the partner of the mother. And during the time in hiding, he also becomes the lover of the daughter. Eventually, all 3 of them are captured. They are interrogated by the Gestapo and they're put on a racial defilation, on a Rassenschande trial. And you could just look at the trial and have this one source, and historians have done that. But you can dig deeper and you can find out that after the war, the daughter and the rescuer have married, and he applied for recognition as unsung heroes, unbesungene Held. And this source will yet cast a different light. But you can go even further and you can look at the Entschädigungsakten, the reparation files, where you find out eventually the 2 of them divorce. And the divorced rescued Jewish daughter speaks about abuse in the marriage, and that casts yet different light. And with all of this, what I want to praise is not finding what has actually happened, but to embrace the ambivalence, the not knowing, the layers of the history, and also how various moments establish a different truth. If that marriage would have remained happy, what happened during the war would have been recalled differently. Since the marriage was really apparently quite a horrible marriage, we have a very different account, and therefore it's also much harder to find and interview the survivors. This is just one example. And I think kind of establishing and embracing the not knowability and ambivalence is immensely inspiring. I will have one more skeptical note, and here I'm just jumping to a different topic. I've been seeing in the UK, and we've been having some very good discussions on Twitter about the downhill path of the British high school education, if it's state education, and basically the death of foreign languages. So unless kids go to private high schools where they learn good German or good French or whatever, they arrive at the university and speak only English. So if they want to go for PhD, the PhDs they write, if they're in Holocaust, are only based on English sources. And in a way, when we force them to actually be able to speak anything but English, we are really class blind. So I have seen it recently in discussions we've been having about manuscript reviews and others. What are we going to do about it, and what kind of scholarship are we going to have? And if we are going to criticize recent PhD graduates for speaking only English, is it not incredibly class obsessed? I don't have an answer for that. But I think this is also something that we will see coming out of the US, and it is also establishment of privilege. Now, I speak 4 languages, but I come from Central Europe, and the context there is very, very different. And I guess I'm a bit of an outlier because I had luck. I am good with languages. My brother is horrible with languages. But it's something I want to kind of throw out there, because I would be loath to say basically only kids who have posh parents and therefore could pick up 2-3 languages easily in high school are worthwhile to go and get a PhD. I don't have an answer for that, but we should really think about it well.
Yeah, that's a very challenging question to all of us. That said, I think that there are a lot of, I participated in a seminar in the spring with mostly colleagues from Eastern Europe. And I think there's so much work to be done in microhistory in Eastern Europe, and that it has to be done by those people who have those native languages to access those sources, because very few of us, be it in Central Europe or be it in North America or Israel, will have that ability to actually access those sources. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, this question of language, isn't it? Joanna, how would you like to sum up our discussion on this question about availability of archival collections and new readings of documentation of the Holocaust?
So I'm glad to Betsy and Anna for raising these very important issues. And of course, we have such limited time that we can't talk about everything, and there's so much to talk about. So I will take a little bit different direction in responding to this question. So while doing research for my project on Jewish children in Krakow, I was very fortunate to access private collections, small collections held by Catholic religious institutions. And these shed light on the extent and modes of helping Jewish children and Jews in general. These records included questionnaires, testimonies, chronicles, letters, photographs, even items that belonged to the hidden Jews. And this material is not readily accessible. And this really points to the problem of dispersion of Holocaust documentation as a major obstacle to using these records and asking new questions of them. And engaging in this research in these small collections, private collections, also made me think about looking beyond the traditional sources. Our panel today meets in this context of a shared history project that tells the history of Jewish life in German-speaking lands through artifacts. And I think that a focus on material culture enriches the way that we relate to and discuss the past, especially now when there is so much emphasis on visual representation of history. And what I also want to say about methods, because Aubrey, your question also related to methods. So in a new book project that I am working on with Elizabeth Barry White, who I think is in the audience today. Elizabeth is a historian at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And in our book project, we employ a myriad of methods to understand both what happened to the protagonist of our study and to her family before, during, and after the Holocaust. Now, just in short, the book tells the story of a Polish Jewish woman, a mathematician from Eastern Galicia, who survived the Holocaust under a false identity as a Polish countess in Lublin. But more than that, in her role as a member of the Polish underground and of a Polish social welfare organization, she was helping Polish prisoners at the Majdanek camp. Now, a study such as this really requires interdisciplinary methods. And here I would like to highlight one of them. So genealogy methods inspire some of the questions that Barry and I ask and how we pursue our research. One example is looking at the social networks of our protagonist and her husband to trace linkages, look for clues. In doing that led us to collections and sources that we would not normally reach doing traditional Holocaust research. The Holocaust broke the generational links. And so by engaging genealogy methods to research and write about the Holocaust, we are not only trying to restore family history, but also reclaim the histories of individuals that otherwise really fade into oblivion.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It made me also think of an untapped source, and there's more and more focus also being put in many, many countries, of course, on the role of the bystander and the non-Jewish bystander. And I think also that there are also in private hands untold sources that can reveal much more about the relationship of non-Jews to Jews and the role of the bystander throughout Europe and in experiencing and witnessing the Holocaust. We've spoken about the aftermath of the Holocaust, not only in terms of memory, but also with regard to rebuilding individual lives, families, and communities, something that Betsy has worked on and in an exemplary way in her book. Betsy, could you begin by offering your reflections on the notion of the continuity of the Holocaust history and the inclusion of the post-war period into Holocaust historiography? You touched on that at the beginning of our discussion.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think that to all of us, the idea that the post-war period is a part of Holocaust history might seem self-evident, but we are Holocaust scholars immersed in this study. And so I think that even if it seems self-evident to us, it's an important question and one that needs to be addressed. We need to think through why it could possibly be seen as something different or separate, so we can explain why it isn't. And certainly as a post-war historian myself, I see a role for sure in Holocaust studies. And so first of all, I mean, maybe the obvious, without the Holocaust, there would be no millions of displaced persons, no hundreds of thousands of homeless European Jews after the war. That's a continuation of that history. And some of the systems and organizations that developed during that time were a direct result of the war and the Holocaust, and the many immigrants to countries around the globe and their influence and impact in their new communities and new homes is a continuation of Holocaust history. But I think it's also evident when you look at a less academic, maybe a more personal approach to the Holocaust, how it affected families. And that's, of course, the very real and big issue of intergenerational transmission of trauma. Also the, not insignificant idea that tens of thousands of people who otherwise would or could have been born in the Soviet Union or Poland or Germany or any number of European countries were born rather in Israel or the United States or Australia, or all kinds of places around the globe. There's also the issues of restitution and reparations, compensation, insurance claims. It's how directly an economic impact was felt on both micro and macro levels. It's how a country like Austria still feels and deals with repercussions of its past and continues to have to deal with the legacies of its many decades-long quote unquote victim claim, if Jewish families and communities were devastated economically and in a way that shaped lives and future generations. I mean, the flip side is also true for the beneficiaries of so-called Aryanization and subsequent generations who have subsumed assets and benefits gained into their own family possessions and in their overall narrative. The repercussions are still being felt on a number of levels, and in that way, Holocaust history certainly didn't end in 1945 and hasn't ended for the people who experienced it and for the purposes of academic study.
I think your last point is very important. So in amongst Jews, one speaks of the Holocaust as there and not then. So it's not a temporal finality. It remains with us to this day. Joanna, your thoughts on the inclusion of post-war history into the Holocaust, which for Poland is so significant?
Exactly. So in the case of Poland, which is my area of scholarly interest, there is this trend to explore the process of emerging from persecution. For example, there's a 2020 book in Polish by Monika Stępień that tells about life in post-war Kraków through the lens of memoirs of Jewish survivors. And really, this is a brilliant study of Jewish daily life from the moments preceding liberation. So not even after liberation, preceding liberation. And we talked previously about language, right? And accessible multilingual sources. We have to understand also that this cutting edge research is being done in languages other than English. And one example of translating that scholarship for English readers is the book by, and Betsy already mentioned, our colleague Łukasz Krzyżanowski, Ghost Citizens, that was published in 2020. And the book focuses on Jewish survivors in a typical Polish city, a city that was on the periphery of post-war Jewish life in Poland. And one of the topics that Krzyżanowski covers is the struggle for the return of Jewish-owned property in Poland that was plundered first by the Nazis and then by the communists in the immediate post-war years. And this leads me to the intertwined issues that bear continued relevance to Holocaust history. And Betsy already alluded to these, and that's compensation and restitution. The 2014 book by Anna Cichopek-Gajraj, Beyond the Violence, engages with the challenges that survivors faced when they tried to reclaim their property in Poland and Slovakia. And the book tells us also, says something about how the Holocaust affected relations between Jews and the local populations. So important research is done about East and Central Europe, but also shifting the attention westward is Shannon Fogg's book, Stealing Home, that was published in 2017. And this book really highlights the continuity of Holocaust history by looking at the connections between plunder, restitution, and reconstruction in France in the years 1942, 1947. So you can see she takes a long arc. Rebuilding Jewish life after the Holocaust would not have been possible without the work of the Claims Conference. And I'm not saying that because it worked for the Claims Conference, but that's history, right? There's a new book, brand new book by Rachel Blumenthal, Right to Reparations, that focuses on the early history of the Claims Conference and sheds light on how the Holocaust continued to reverberate in efforts to pursue justice, a measure of justice, and in efforts to define and ensure the rights of Holocaust survivors.
Yeah, that brings up also a question of communal heritage and what happened to communal heritage after the Holocaust. and all of the unsolved and ongoing issues in many, many respects, the rediscovery of Jewish cultural heritage and what's happening with it today. Anna, some final thoughts on this aspect of post-war history as integrated into the overall Holocaust historiography?
Yes, I have one small point that I want to add, and it builds on much of what Betsy and Joanna mentioned before me. When you look at the main trends of post-war Jewish history of the Holocaust, it was a lot about categorization, about making sense and about judgment, about finding the good guys and finding the bad guys and explaining why the bad guys were bad. I mean, we all know about the Jewish Council debate, but I think it's worth thinking about it in terms of intellectual history, what was actually being done here. And then you start having a watershed in the 1980s with Dandiner and later with Doron Rabinovich and Beate Meyer, who say, this is a pointless debate. We have established that Chaim Rumkowski did not do something amazing. We should rather ask, what was the experience? What was the subjectivity? What was the leeway? Why were they hated so much? And then you kind of have a paradigm shift that you stop trying to establish who was good and who was bad, but rather trying to understand and also look at the societal mechanisms. And I think all three of us stand kind of on the other end of the divide, but sometimes we also deal with a certain discomfort where we speak in a different paradigm and do not want to kind of engage with the older debates because they are passé. They have been discussed. There is nothing to add to that. Like if you need my book to find out that Jewish denunciation is bad, then I really think people have a different problem. But I thought just recently, my colleague Sonia Baeck wrote this beautiful book about Jewish courts in the Nazi ghettos. And there was this somewhat petty review of a legal scholar who was uncomfortable with this new paradigm she's breaking and asking exactly these questions about how much history can we write. And if you do not have the courage to look at the face of the society in extreme, then maybe we should not be interested in Holocaust history at all. And this is what I find so beautiful and inspiring about these histories that have been written recently, whether it's sexual violence against children, queer sexuality, the ambivalence of return, living in Vienna, having anti-Semitic neighbors and still eating strudel and living on. Making space for these contradictions is something that kind of makes me feel quite warm about the history we are writing and we are reading.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think there's also a lot of work still to be done about Jewish relationships post-war. Betsy also mentioned the fact that, and in Berlin was the case, of course, that the overwhelming majority of Jews who survived in the city were living in mixed marriages or the children of those mixed marriages. And there hasn't been really that much work done on the relationships between the returning Jews and that population who were Viennese, as you said, Betsy, and who had not been deported and who were there, and those relationships. As a final question, we spoke about Holocaust historiography providing windows onto aspects of the Jewish experience in the broadest of spectrums. And based on all of your researches, what does the Holocaust in areas that you have studied convey about Jewish history per se? And what does it say about the relationships between Jews as an important element of the experience and survival of the Holocaust? Betsy, we're going to begin with you again.
Well, especially in terms of my work and what I was working on with returning and regaining home and the Jewish community, I think most importantly it conveys that there was continuity. Jewish communities were fundamentally altered, and yes, certainly in places wiped off the map. But there are continuing, vibrant, living Jewish communities in Europe. Nothing like before, but maybe nothing like might be assumed either. In the case of Viennese Jews, I found that a post-war identity and that continuity, however different and changed it was, also involved, I'd say, a sense of discretion. Post-war Viennese Jewish identity had to develop in the context of a post-war Austrian national identity that was based on the so-called victim myth, the idea that Austria and Austrians were the first victims of the Nazis. And to find one's place in that society meant taking part in a national silence on the truth of Austrian involvement as perpetrators and as a former Nazi country. And the best way to do that for most was to adopt sort of a don't ask, don't tell policy with relation to the years of the Holocaust. I mean, if I don't ask my neighbor about the war years, then I don't have to know what he or she did or what he or she thinks. And likewise, Gentile neighbors maintained their own denial by not engaging with what had happened to their Jewish neighbors, either as individuals or as a community. And however we may feel about this and the unfairness of it, it served many well. And today the Jewish community has a recognized role and place in Austrian, particularly Viennese society. And over time, with a change in national attitude about the past, thanks to many dedicated scholars and journalists, the experience of Austrian Jews and a confrontation with the actual role of Austrian perpetrators and bystanders is recognized as a part of Austrian history. There's still work to do, but it's getting there. And the relationships between Jews as a part of the post-war history, the Viennese Jewish community, has to do with the institutional and communal support of their own community, but also international Jewish organizations, active work and assistance. In the years that the Austrian government offered little or no support for Jewish victims, the community and communal organizations, Jewish communal organizations, provided what they could and organized as they could to support one another, also with the help of those international organizations. So the rehabilitation and revival of the Jewish community is all about the interactions between and relationships of Jews.
Absolutely. What you were saying before made me think that one of the tragic consequences of the situation that surviving Jews found themselves in societies where the war and the Holocaust couldn't be spoken about is that was in part internalized within Jewish families themselves. Also that within the families themselves, there was a don't ask and don't tell. I've spoken with so many survivors who have transmitted to me that their parents and grandparents did not speak at all about their experiences. So they did not share them within their own families. I think that is at least an indirect consequence of the situation of not being heard by society in the post-war years. Anna.
Okay. I would like to touch on the first half of the question, because something that I really tried to do in my book is to take Holocaust out of its corner of exceptionalism and look at it in the framework of bigger history, not only to ask what do various historical theories or insights we have from French history or history of famine tell us about the Holocaust, but also what are the insights we can observe in the extreme societies, say of Theresienstadt or of Auschwitz, that we can then apply for bigger history. Let me give you an example. Not many people know that, and I'm privileged to know that and to have read the wonderful book that one of the first books that Professor Warwick has written is a medical history of children and war. And it's literally called, and I think it's a quote, "War is good for children and small infants." And there she shows how it is often during the war that medicine makes a big leap forward. And this kind of thinking about crisis situations as a chance for medicine to take charge, and to also medical personnel often seeing the crisis as a moment to thrive, I have been able to observe in Theresienstadt, where other people are prisoners, but the physicians are physicians. And if they survive, they write up the observations from Theresienstadt and publish it in medical journals, and they put it on their CV. We know it from, what's her name? I had COVID in August and it's horrible for my memory. But we know it from this woman, famous woman doctor who was in Auschwitz. We know it for Lily Pokorná, the head of radiology of Theresienstadt. We know it for others. And to then ask questions, why is it so important for people to have their career belonging? Why do prisoner functionaries observe imprisonment as a kind of bureaucratic administrative challenge in which they can solve the Holocaust through those bits? And that kind of leads me to my insight about Jewish history, that while everybody who was deported to Theresienstadt was sent there because they were racially Jewish, the Nazis could mark them according to Nuremberg laws as Jewish. It did not engender a more saliently Jewish community. It did engender a mass narrative of what it means to be in Theresienstadt, but people started differentiating and ethnicizing each other. Czech Jews looked at the German Jews and said they were too assimilated or too observant or too German and different. And the same happened for the observations of Czech Jews. And you see here a creation of ethnic differences out of nowhere, because these people were really, really quite similar, like the people today on the panel. None of us really look strikingly ethnically different, which is a confirmation of the old insight we know from constructionist anthropology or ethnology, if you want, that ethnicity and race is a construction. This is an insight we know about Jewish history, but has not been taken quite as seriously as I think it ought to be for Holocaust history. So to look at the concentration camp and ghettos and see how ethnicity plays out, how also certain moments of racism and othering work out, and what to make sense of it, that's something that I have really tried to analyze in more detail. And it shows, and now it's a kind of quick spoiler, that really when we think about the interwar studies about cultural and social histories of Central European Jewry, the German, the Austrian, the Dutch, the Czech, is that we should take assimilation really, really seriously, especially for Czech Jews. That also obviously then ties to Betsy's point about return, because often the really strong emotional belonging for these people, the home, the moment that makes them cry, is Prague. And even some of the hardcore Zionists would cry in Theresienstadt when somebody would show them a picture of Moldau and the Prague castle. A fraction of them were lucky, they survived. And whether they studied in Czechoslovakia or went to Tel Aviv or ended up in Brooklyn was often quite accidental.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you very much. You raised a point which I think quite a number of Holocaust historians really also view the experience of the Orthodox as being very much under-illuminated. And Joanna touches on that also in her work with regard to education, children in education, and the education within the more Orthodox sphere. Joanna, your last thoughts before we then take some questions from our illustrious audience?
Yes, thank you, Aubrey. So I will respond to the first part of your question about the relevance of Holocaust history for Jewish history. And the history of Jewish children in Krakow during the Holocaust is important for understanding Polish Jewish history and contemporary Jewish life in Poland. So that kind of brings us to the relevance of Holocaust history to Jewish history and to today. Holocaust history is really crucial for understanding the choices and the tragic stories of child survivors who stayed in Poland and of their descendants. So what do I mean by that? Jewish children, as we know, endured hiding and life under a false identity to try to survive. Now, those who knew that they were Jewish, they learned to conceal the fact very well. Jewishness exposed these children to danger during the war. So those child survivors who stayed in Poland, they had these experiences, these memories, right, and associations of what it means to be Jewish. And these child survivors who stayed in Poland rarely had opportunity to engage in Jewish life outside the major Jewish centers. Then we have younger children who were too young to know about their Jewish origin during the Holocaust. And if they remained with their protectors, with their wartime protectors, these children sometimes did not learn about their Jewish roots until much later in their lives, when they were adults. By adults, I mean going into their 50s and 60s. And some child survivors decided not to share that information with their family members, the information that they're Jewish. So there's a generational break in the awareness of and the connection to Jewish identity. And that in turn affects subsequent, what had been dubbed as the Renaissance revival of Jewish life in Poland after the fall of communism. And it affects the phenomenon of the so-called coming out of Poles who also happen to be Jewish. So this is the relevance that I see, one of the many of Holocaust history to Jewish history and contemporary Jewish life.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand it over to David. We can't see, I don't believe our panelists can't see what questions are coming in, but I would imagine that the discussion amongst our distinguished panelists have given rise to lots of comments and questions, David?
There are a lot of great questions. I think actually the panelists can see them because I saw Anna typing an answer. But
okay.
I regret that we won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll try to pick out a few that will hopefully everyone will be interested in, and that maybe might, get us into some new territory or expand on things. So the first one came in relatively early when Anna was talking about the responsibility to also act as public intellectuals. This is a question from Ren Fiss that asks about the sort of political valence of the Holocaust, particularly in contemporary Germany. And the questioner asks about the German catechism debate involving Dirk Moses and others, and how this may impact the understanding of the Holocaust and its future historiography. And I think that's focused on contemporary Germany, but of course the Holocaust has a political valence in other countries in Europe too. So I think if anyone wanted to focus on that instead, we'd be happy to hear what you have to say.
So as the catechism debate was ongoing, a lot of people said sometimes very eloquent and sometimes less so points. For example, my friend Jennifer Evans and my other friend Svenja Goltemann have organized a New Fascism Syllabus and Geschichte der Gegenwart, really amazing forums. And I did not contribute because I didn't want to. It's also really hot water that you get into. I thought the interview that Jennifer Evans gave, where she pointed out who is listened to, who is marked up as historical, who is marked up as reliant, is very, very insightful. And I've been somewhat frustrated by certain kind of summaries of the debate that completely disregard women's contributions. That applies for both ends. Both kind of parts of the discussion disregard women's contributions. They have that in common while they disagree on so much. At the end of the day, for me, it boils down to whom do we want to open up history? Do migrants, do non-white people in Germany have the right to kind of contribute to the discussion and say, this is not my history, these are my opinions about the Holocaust, this is my bigger narrative about dislocation, migration, expulsion, and genocide, and are Germans ready to open up for it like we are struggling to do in the UK, and like US has been actually quite open in the last few years. Susan Niemann, I never know how her last name is pronounced, from the Einstein Forum, has actually amended her otherwise very optimistic memoir, Learning from the Germans, in light of what has happened. And I thought some of the discussions surrounding, say, Max Czolek this summer, and about who is allowed to be Jewish and who is allowed to speak for the Jews, and if you are a lefty Jew, do you actually count? Cast some very sobering light about the debates. There would be much to be said on that. But the question is it worth the headache you will get? And I have enough headache with working on history of sexuality, and that's what I will say.
Joanna or Betsy, do you want to jump in on that, or should we can also move on? Okay, so we have another question from Dr. Mitch Gerber, who asks, of course, you're all historians, but he asks about methodologies from other fields, medicine, neuroscience, psychology. How fruitful do you think this might be to the history of the Holocaust?
I would kind of refer back to part of what I was discussing before, and I think that the contributions of psychologists have been great to the field of Holocaust studies and understanding the history and the development of the understanding of the history, also because it comes along with, at the same time, families and survivors and their children and grandchildren dealing with the history and how it impacts them. The role of and the insight from psychology in particular, I think, has been extremely important. My colleagues want to comment on the other methodologies.
Sure, I can comment on the on medicine, and I think that that offers such a fascinating lens to look at the Holocaust. And there is a new center for the study of, and I will not say what the name is because I don't know the exact name, but it has to do with Holocaust, human rights, genocide, and medicine. And it's run by Sari Siegel, who is a historian of the Holocaust. And so clearly there is interest in this area, and scholars are working on the medical aspects. I have one of my colleagues at the Claims Conference is working on the persecution against women in Auschwitz, and medical experiments done on women in particular. So clearly there is interest.
Yeah, and I would also kind of put it the other way around, not only how do Holocaust historians or Holocaust studies people take on history of medicine or neuroscience and psychology, but also what do insights from our work can be taken on board by medical researchers and whatnot. I have written in a whole chapter in my book about medicine and diseases and the mentality of the medical personnel in Terezince that I then published as the only outside piece in social history of medicine. You have seen that I also engage with Deborah Dwork's work. And I think there are many, many insights to be drawn out of the observations from the Holocaust. We should get away from only Lucy Adelsberger, that's the name I was blanking out before, or say the hunger disease from Warsaw Ghetto, but to also kind of engage with the scholarship that is happening today. But kind of the exchange needs to go in both ways. In terms of psychology, I try to think about the transport psychology and the psychology of bad news in the last 6th chapter of my book. One thing that we are not there yet for Holocaust, but is definitively happening in terms of history of sexuality, is it would be very interesting if you look at the burgeoning scholarship on sexuality and the Holocaust, sexual violence and the Holocaust through the prisma of history of medicine.
So there are 2 questions that came in recently about one about the rise of the far right and fascist political parties in Europe today, and recent rallies that took place in Poland, and then another one about policies, I guess particularly in Hungary and Poland, having to do that directly impact his Holocaust historiography by scholars in those countries. Would anyone like to comment further on that?
Sure, I can offer a short comment. I also want to mention that I realized I didn't mention my colleague's name, who's doing research on the medical experiment, and that's Ruth Weinberger. So I'm correcting that. In terms of the rise of the far right movement and kind of the assaults on Holocaust scholarship in countries in East Central Europe, there's been obviously a great discussion about this in American press. We can read it in English. And we actually see the problem of distortion of the Holocaust and minimizing the Holocaust as a worldwide trend that is not only confined to East Central Europe. We tend to kind of highlight these cases because that's where basically the Holocaust happened, right? That's where the camps were. 3 million Jews were murdered in Poland, right? 90% of the population. So of course we tend to focus on these countries, but I think we have to understand that this is a global trend, and the question is, what do we do with that? Here we are meeting about the past, the present, and the future of Holocaust historiography, and we raised the question, and I think Anna, you actually, earlier you pointed this out, about disseminating this knowledge, sharing it in terms of education, social media, and so on. So I think these are also questions, that relevant questions that we should be engaging in on how to counter that sort of minimizing and distortion of Holocaust history.
Well, thank you so much, Joanna. I think we have time for maybe just a couple more questions. It's getting close to an hour and a half, and I know this is such we could obviously go on much longer, but just want to refer to a comment that someone wrote that I thought was interesting. Ron Dorsback writes about his mother, Robert Dorsback, who was born in 1921 and is 100 years old. Her mind is still very sharp. It's a longer comment, so I'll just paraphrase. He writes that his mother has stories of anti-Semitism, but also of kindness from Germans. I presume he doesn't say this explicitly, but coming from the Leo Baeck Institute, but a deep sense of belonging in Germany. But he expresses a concern that's sort of unfamiliar to me, just being immersed in this perspective of Leo Baeck Institute, that discussing, that sort of acknowledging these stories of kindness from Germans or sense of belonging in German society might somehow be misused by Holocaust deniers. And I'm just interested in your perspective as historians, how you deal with this kinds of issues, or how historiography has dealt with them in general. Yeah, Anna.
Yeah, I think we should take away from the assumption that there are universally problematic topics. Whether topic is problematic or not is always produced by the given social field, and it will depend on generation, and it will depend on the country, it will depend on class, and so on and so on. I think we do ourselves a favor if we do the history that interests us. That's also, for me, the best way to be happy. I do the work that I actually want to know the answers for. To go to the earlier question about the rise of the populism, I mean, if I knew how to fight the populism, I would be president. Nobody knows how to fight the populism. I mean, we think we know, but it does not really work, or it's really complicated. But my modest take is that a bit of a problem with the kind of popular depiction of the Holocaust, that it's about 5 centimeters deep, it's really shallow, and it's incredibly sentimentalized, and it's full of these kind of black and white schablons, figures that are not real people. If we allow for more in-depth, ambivalent, complex histories about people who err, who mistake, who love, who hate, who do real things, who try to survive and they fail, maybe people will feel that they engage with real history, and they'll kind of take some things. But what do I know? That would be my answer to the person who asked the question. Don't be afraid, do the history for yourself. You will sleep better.
And I would agree for sure. Also, that the important message is that people did this to people, and people are multi-layered and very, very different. And it's all a part of the nuance of this. It wasn't just good guys and bad guys. And it's actually a very important element of understanding or trying to understand this history.
Yeah, and if I can just add that, I mean, the whole issue of people assisting Jews during the Holocaust period is extremely complex. The reasons, the motivations for people doing that, it's anything but black and white. That said, I don't know if I really understand the comment because of this fear of misuse of addressing kindness of non-Jews towards Jews during the period of Holocaust. And I don't know if Robert is familiar with an institution called Stille Helden in Berlin, which for 2 decades now has been really addressing the biographies of people who provided refuge for Jews in all of its complexity, not only out of sheer acts of kindness, but in many cases also for self-aggrandization purposes, for monetary purposes. So as everything to do with Holocaust history, it's extremely complex. And I agree wholeheartedly with Anna that we can't shy away from what we feel are difficult questions.
Yeah, thank you all. For a final question, a couple people mentioned a challenge, like a very immediate challenge of collecting testimony from the last survivors who were children. One person mentions the Shoah Foundation's video project, and another person just references this issue in general. And I wonder if you can give some perspective on how important that is, what resources are being directed towards it, or perhaps actually it's something that's been done fairly completely and is maybe doesn't seem as urgent.
So I will just offer a short comment to this. And we're really blessed to have many excellent projects that by universities, institutions, other grassroots efforts to collect oral histories of survivors. And many projects are ongoing, and the Shoah Foundation, as I understand, has this kind of last chance program to collect testimonies from survivors who haven't been interviewed to date. And from my own experience, I can say that the project is not done. There are so many other survivors whose stories remain unknown. And when I was doing my research, I recorded survivors and their histories. And some of these survivors told their stories for the very first time. And so clearly, we need to get out there as Holocaust historians, oral historians as well, and collect these histories.
I would just underscore that I think probably all of us experience, frequently people coming to us and saying, my mother's a Holocaust survivor, my grandmother's a Holocaust survivor, and she's never talked about it, and she's never given testimony. And sometimes working so as immersed in this field and as I do in the middle of the Holocaust Museum, it seems like we've got so much, but there's still a considerable amount of information that's been lost, unfortunately, but also still to be found.
I see that the person who asked the question stresses very correctly that they are asking about Gentile bystander population. I find it difficult because these people are so influenced by the master narrative, how they are supposed to remember the Holocaust. And we should really be asking the methodological questions that generations of oral historians have established for us, how to do oral histories. I mean, it's just recently that the great Joan Ringelheim, who was for many years the director of the Oral History Archive of the USHMM, just passed away. And it's kind of heartbreaking when we look that in the middle of the 90s, she was trying to publish her book about women in the Holocaust. She did not get a publisher, although she had a publisher who then dumped her. And today, gender in the Holocaust, women in the Holocaust is kind of the big hot topic. So there is a bitterness to it. In my field, in Central Europe, pretty much everybody has been interviewed. Many people have been interviewed multiple times. It adds layers, it's interesting. But what really keeps me busy at night are rather the people who have not been interviewed or the topics that have been erased. How society creates stories that are best left to be silent, and that this is a social construction. Why do we have almost no queer Holocaust survivors who bore testimony about same-sex desire in the concentration camps? Why does this ongoing homophobia basically has erased all of them? I found the first lesbian Holocaust survivor who bore testimony and interviewed her because I came to her as an out lesbian woman. Something similar applies to parents who left their children behind at selection in Auschwitz or elsewhere, and say the work of Jesus, COVID is horrible. My wonderful colleague from Toronto, on whose name I'm blanking out, on infanticide in the Holocaust, has cast light how difficult it is to get these testimonies. So we really need to also pay attention how social rules of what is acceptable has created a space of what can be narrated. I mean, second wave of feminism has enabled women and later men in the 1970s and 1980s to testify about the experience of sexual violence, and the Borat work, Dorota Glowacka and others have written about, say, Nate Leipziger, who eventually was able to write a memoir where he wrote about his experience of rape. So to me, when we think about all history and the gaps, we should also speak about how our own society has created an erased archive.
Yeah, that's a really important observation. I think that it's not just that you can't just check a box when someone has given their testimony. It's about what was asked and sort of what the expectations were of the person who gave the interview. So, well, it's been a really fascinating hour and 40 minutes. And for those of you in Europe, it's getting quite late, and I think the rest of us also have to go. But I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. Aubrey, Anna, Joanna, and Betsy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and sharing your work and your insights.